At the center of Adolf Hitler's thought was an unshakable idea. The world was a constant battlefield, where nations, like individuals, were doomed to fight for their survival. For Hitler, history was a biological struggle between races, morality an invention of the weak, and peace an illusion serving only to lull peoples destined for domination. Born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he observed from a young age what he considered the failure of German national unity. He saw the empire's ethnic and cultural diversity as a sign of decline. His experience in Vienna between 1908 and 1913 was decisive. The imperial city, with its mixture of peoples, religions, and dialects, offered him a human laboratory in which his hatred crystallized. There he read nationalist pamphlets, listened to anti-Semitic speeches, and absorbed the idea that Judaism was not a religion, but an international conspiracy against the purity of nations. This conviction became the central axis of his thought. In Mein Kampf, published between 1925 and 1926, Hitler developed his worldview in a prophetic tone. He argued that Germany's fate was predetermined by blood, and that its historical duty was to expand eastward to secure the Lebensraum that its people needed to thrive. In his view, the Slavic peoples were inferior races, doomed to serve or disappear. Marxism, he argued, was a Jewish invention for the destruction of nations from within, and democracy a mask for weakness. In his view, only a racially pure dictatorship could restore Germany's greatness. The First World War reinforced all these ideas. The defeat of 1918 and the Treaty of Versailles became a symbol of national humiliation. Hitler did not see this outcome as a military consequence, but as an internal betrayal, a conspiracy orchestrated by socialists, Jews, and liberals. This stab in the back, as he called it, was a myth he needed to justify his future rise. His thoughts were transformed into a religion of national redemption. Germany had to be purified through war, sacrifice, and absolute obedience to a leader destined by history in Hitler's worldview. Nature knew no compassion. Only the strongest species survived, and the weak deserved to disappear. This distorted Darwinian idea was transferred to human and political relations. Hitler saw the German people as a collective organism. Every individual was supposed to serve the racial body, and those who did not serve were parasites. In his speeches, he repeated that modern man had forgotten the harshness of life, and that his mission was to restore the fighting instinct. The world will not change through speeches, but through iron and blood, he said. Convinced that history rewards nations willing to kill for their destiny, his vision of art, education, and culture flowed from the same principle. Everything was to serve the racial state. Art was to exalt strength, discipline, and purity. Education was to shape bodies and minds. Science was to be subordinated to the biological goal of the Reich. For Hitler, reason was useful only when it served the will of the people. He disdained free thought and intellectual debate, which he considered decadent. Instead, he promoted an aesthetic of grandeur and purity, a pagan spirituality focused on blood and soil. Christianity, though used in his public rhetoric, was suspicious to him. He saw it as a religion of compassion, hostile to struggle. However, he understood its symbolic power and used it to legitimize his cause. In his rhetoric, conduct replaced God, an abstract force guiding strong nations to victory. I am fulfilling the will of the Creator by fighting the Jews. He even claimed that in his mind, extermination was not a crime, but divine obedience. Hitler constructed his ideology as a closed system. Any evidence contradicting it was reinterpreted as evidence of a conspiracy by his enemies. His political entourage, consisting of figures like Goebbels, Himmler, and Rosenberg, reinforced this bubble of absolute thought. Nazi propaganda became the perfect tool to transform his Weltanschauung into national common sense. The figure of the Führer was elevated to the rank of an infallible prophet, and millions of Germans began to see the world through his eyes as a struggle between purity and corruption, between fate and betrayal. Re-equipment and military training were conducted in secret. When Hitler came to power in January in 1933, the Treaty of Versailles still hung over Germany like a chain, It limited its army to 100,000 men, banned military aviation, and restricted naval construction. For him, these conditions were a humiliation imposed by enemies who feared the return of German power. In his first speeches to the leaders of the Reichswehr, the new chancellor made it clear that the treaty must be abrogated not through negotiations, but through deeds. Laws are not asked for, they are imposed, he said. And so, rearmament began in secret. Hitler understood that his main weapon was not steel, but time. In the early years of the Third Reich, his strategy was to win every possible minute, deceiving the Western powers with a veneer of moderation. He appointed Hermann Göring to head the newly created aviation ministry, disguised as a civilian institution. At the same time, German laboratories began developing engines, aircraft, and bombs under the guise of scientific research. The Daimler concern and Messerschmitt factories were working at full capacity under secret state contracts. In 1934, Hitler consolidated absolute control over the armed forces after the Night of the Long Knives Purge, during which he eliminated Ernst-Röhm and the SA leadership. He secured the support of the regular army, which saw him as a defender of order against revolution. With the death of President Hindenburg in 1934, he proclaimed himself Führer and Reich Chancellor, uniting political and military leadership. From then on, all oaths of allegiance were to be sworn directly to him, not to the German state. Propaganda presented rearmament as a spiritual rebirth. At the Nuremberg parades, Hitler demonstrated to the nation his new faith in steel and discipline. Meanwhile, the world watched with a mixture of indifference and hope. Many European leaders, especially in Great Britain, saw the new regime as a bulwark against Soviet communism. Hitler knew how to exploit this perception. Each time he expanded the army or violated a treaty clause, he promised that this was the final step, that his only desire was to restore German dignity. In March 1935, he dealt the final blow. He publicly announced the reinstatement of universal conscription and the creation of the Luftwaffe, an air force that already existed in secret. This was an act of open defiance of the international order, but the reaction was weak. France protested, Great Britain expressed concern, and the League of Nations did nothing. Hitler interpreted this silence as a sign that the democracies were unwilling to fight for the peace they claimed to defend. That same year, he launched the 4-year plan, entrusting its implementation to Göring. The goal was to make Germany a self-sufficient power capable of enduring a long war. Investments were directed towards steel, synthetic fuels, and heavy weapons. Industry was reorganized according to the logic of permanent mobilization. The economy, science, and youth were subordinated to the military project. Hitler believed that the will of the people could overcome any material limitations, and that the planet's resources inherently belonged to the strong races. In March 1936, German troops crossed the Rhine and remilitarized the demilitarized zone, another action prohibited by the same side. It was a reckless gamble. The army was still weak, and a French military response would have destroyed the regime. But no one reacted. Hitler interpreted this as confirmation of his fate. That night, he told his officers, "Now, I know I can do anything." From then on, his confidence in his own strategic intuition became dogma. In the following years, he strengthened his system of alliances and espionage. Italy under Mussolini became his natural partner. Both regimes shared the rhetoric of expansionism and contempt for liberal democracies. Japan. In Asia, it joined the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936, strengthening the ideological front against communism. Hitler saw this alliance as proof that history was on his side, that the warlike nations of the world were uniting against Western decline. Goebbels's propaganda apparatus simultaneously intensified its efforts. Every announcement of a new weapon or diplomatic victory was presented as a triumph of national will. The German people saw not tanks or planes, but symbols of pride. Schools instilled obedience and a willingness to sacrifice. Hitler Youth boys, physically trained for battle, and workers marched to the rhythm of the slogan about the Reich's destiny. The country had become a psychological war machine even before the first shot was fired. In front of the world, Hitler maintained a double veneer. On international platforms, he spoke of peace, European cooperation, and respect between nations. In private, he dictated orders to accelerate the production of cannons and armored vehicles. His meetings with military leaders were meticulous, almost theatrical. He demanded reports on every caliber, every aircraft, every logistical plan, convinced that the next war must be won before it even began. In his mind, Germany was a besieged fortress that had to prepare for the inevitable clash. By 1938, rearmament was almost complete. Germany produced more steel than Great Britain and France combined. New tank divisions, destined to become the future backbone of the Blitzkrieg, were ready. That same year, Hitler made his next move: Austria. The annexation, presented as a fraternal alliance, was in fact a carefully planned invasion. The Anschluss was carried out without a single shot being fired. The Western powers, the Germans, paralyzed by the memory of the Great War, accepted the fait accompli. The Austrian success convinced Hitler of the infallibility of his intuition. If the world had not dared to defend Vienna, it would not do so in the case of Czechoslovakia. In September 1938, at the Munich Conference, he succeeded in forcing the democracies to cede the Sudetenland under the pretext of protecting ethnic Germans. What others saw as diplomacy, he interpreted as capitulation. His strategy of deception had worked. Germany had rebuilt its army, expanded its borders, and humiliated its enemies. All this without open war. By the end of 1938, Hitler was convinced that history protected him. The Wehrmacht was the instrument of his will, and Europe a board where fear reigned. Only one step remained: transform rearmament into conquest. The rationale for the invasion of Poland. In Hitler's mind, the war against Poland was not aggression, but a historical necessity. For years, he spoke of Lebensraum, the living space that Germany needed to conquer in the East to ensure its survival. Poland, created after the Treaty of Versailles, symbolized everything he despised: an artificial nation, supported by the Allies, and populated, according to his rhetoric, by mixed races incapable of self-government. For Hitler, its mere existence was a challenge to the fate of the German people. In the first months of 1939, his tone changed. He no longer spoke of justice or reparations, but of destiny. In closed meetings with his generals, he argued that Germany must act before the democracies could react. He knew that his army was ready, that his industry could withstand war, and that the population blindly followed him. In his logic, all that remained was to construct a justification. The aggressor was to be portrayed as the victim. At the beginning of the year, he ordered Goebbels' propaganda machine to prepare a narrative about the abuses suffered by German minorities in the Polish corridor and the free town of Donetsk. The Nazi press began publishing false stories about murdered peasants, raped women, and persecuted German families. Newsreels showed images of coffins draped with German flags, and every official speech ended with the same thought: Germany could not remain indifferent to the suffering of its people. Diplomacy, meanwhile, was a carefully constructed farce. To the world, Hitler presented himself as a patient leader, ready to negotiate. He spoke of self-determination and peace, knowing that European democracies feared another war. But secretly, as early as April, he had already given the order to prepare for the invasion. The plan was called Fallweis, or Case White, and set the start of the operation for September 1939. Hitler needed not a moral excuse, but a theatrical act, ostensibly defensive. The idea for a staged provocation originated within the SS. Reinhard Heydrich, acting on Himmler's orders, devised a false flag operation to justify the offensive on the night of August 31st. A group of agents, disguised in Polish uniforms, attacked the German radio station in the town of Globus. They left behind them several corpses, prisoners from the Dachau concentration camp, executed minutes earlier and dressed as enemy soldiers at dawn. The news spread throughout Germany. Poland had attacked the Reich. Hitler appeared before the Reichstag on September 1st, 1939. His carefully crafted speech mixed indignation, fate, and revenge. As of this morning, German troops will respond to the Polish attacks, he proclaimed. In reality, more than 1.5 million German soldiers were already advancing across Polish territory. The invasion was swift and devastating. The Wehrmacht deployed an unprecedented combination of tank forces, mobile artillery, and air power. This was the practical birth of the Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Hitler looked at the maps with satisfaction. Within days, the Polish defense collapsed. Columns of tanks crisscrossed the country, while the Air Force's backlash destroyed roads, trains, and civilian shelters. At his meetings, the Führer spoke with mystical fervor of the historical justice unfolding before his eyes. He saw war not as a political act, but as a biological one, the expansion of a strong nation at the expense of a weak one. For him, every conquered city was a victory for nature. On September 3rd, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. Hitler had not expected it so soon. For years, he had been counting on fear to paralyze them, as in Munich. But this time, the silence was broken. Nevertheless, he remained steadfast. Before his generals, he smiled and said, "Now everything will depend on who holds out the longest." He believed that democracies lack the will to sacrifice. His confidence in victory was absolute. As the Wehrmacht advanced, Hitler gave the order to cooperate with the Soviet Union. A few weeks earlier, he had signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Officially, it was a neutrality agreement, but it contained a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. On September 17th, the Red Army invaded Poland from the east, completing the division of the country. For Hitler, it was a brilliant move. He neutralized his most feared enemy, the Soviet Union, and avoided a war on two fronts. Images of a devastated Warsaw were celebrated in Berlin as a triumph. Goebbels organized parades, films, and newsreels showing Hitler as the restorer of order. The invasion, presented as a liberation operation, reinforced his aura of infallibility. Deep down, he believed that fate was guiding him. "Nothing can stop us," he told his ministers. The next step would be dictated by the outcome. In the occupied territories, the SS and Gestapo began their own work. As the army advanced, the Einsatzgruppen executed Polish intellectuals, officers, and priests. Hitler saw these actions as a political imperative, to destroy national identity, to erase any possibility of resistance. War, from his perspective, was not only a military matter, but also a racial one. Poland had to disappear as a nation to make way for the future German Empire. By the end of September, the country was divided. Warsaw fell on the 27th, and the last Polish territory surrendered on October 6th. In Berlin, Hitler was greeted by jubilant crowds. Flags fluttered from balconies. Children sang national anthems, and newspapers wrote about the Führer's strategic genius. In the Chancellor's palace, officers watched him walk with slow, confident steps, like an actor in his sacred robes. He believed he had proven that history responded to his will, that war was a test of faith, and that the gods of fate had chosen Germany to rewrite the map of Europe. Admiration for the Blitzkrieg of his first victories. Hitler watched the Blitzkrieg campaigns with a mixture of technical admiration and ideological ecstasy. Blitzkrieg was not the Führer's miraculous invention, but it fit perfectly into his worldview: speed, decisiveness, and the destruction of the enemy. Before the enemy could form its resistance, he observed the coordination between tank units, air forces, and artillery as a choreography designed to impose Germany's will through efficiency. The Western Campaign of 1940 was his great cinematic triumph. The strategy that led to the fall of France combined operational daring with political cunning. After simulating an offensive from the north, the Germans executed a real maneuver through the Ardennes, in a region the Allies considered impassable for large tank formations. When tank columns emerged from an unexpected direction, the collapse was as psychological as it was military. Paris fell with such speed that it paralyzed Western Europe. In Berlin, news came like sacred deeds, with colorful maps of advances, photographs of armies occupying squares, and a growing sense of a Führer who seemed to touch history with his fingertips. Hitler used these victories not only as military achievements, but also as acts of personal legitimation. Each conquest fueled the narrative of infallibility that was forming in propaganda. In his mind, military genius was not a matter of luck, but a matter of vision. His ability to sense the pulse of a nation, make decisions without hesitation, and impose his will on moral and political institutions. The speed of the Blitzkrieg reinforced his conviction that war could be reduced to a cactus of concentrated and organized will. Norway and Denmark, in April 1940, offered another demonstration of the versatility of the German military machine. The operation combined amphibious landings, paratroopers, and the rapid neutralization of enemy forces to secure access to the North Atlantic and Norwegian iron resources. Hitler valued these successes for their combination of operational audacity and strategic results, protecting supply routes, controlling ports, and securing industrial raw materials. Each successful mission confirmed a mental template. If speed and surprise were supported by logistics, war became a series of almost inevitable victories. The fall of France, however, had a profound symbolic effect. The humiliation of the Third Republic and its capitulation without a sustained defense in the heart of Europe reinforced in Hitler the idea of Western weakness. He interpreted the lack of will to fight as a historical debt that democracies would pay again and again. The occupation of Paris was portrayed in the Nazi press as the completion of a cycle, the restoration of German honor, and the confirmation of the Führer as its architect. Reich iconography, consisting of flags, banners, and anthems, became inseparable from the narrative of swift and complete victory from Berlin. The Blitzkrieg seemed to justify everything at the front. However, the reality was different, with nuances that didn't change Hitler's perception. The troops faced logistical problems. Tank columns suffered from shortages of maintenance and fuel, and the occupation brought the need to administer territories with a hostile population. But these obstacles did not contradict the Führer's central thesis. Blitzkrieg allows for the imposition of quick decisions, and therefore, resistance against the willow could be destroyed before structural weaknesses became a threat. In domestic politics, victories created a feedback effect. Collective euphoria reinforced obedience and loyalty to the leadership. The cult of personality was fueled by military triumphs, presented as proof of a higher truth. History favored the strong in the Chancellor's speeches. Every advancement became a moral principle. Blitzkrieg became a metaphor for the purity and decisiveness that were to govern the life of the Reich. However, Hitler's admiration for Blitzkrieg had conceptual limits. He equated it with total victory and applied it as a universal doctrine. Speed ceased to be merely a tactic and became a strategic imperative. War must be quick or not at all. This premise would later lead him to an overly optimistic assessment of operations, whose logistical and geographical variables exceeded the flexibility of Blitzkrieg. While Europe was being transformed under the shadow of the Reich, Hitler looked at the Continental Board with the confidence of a man who believes he holds the winning card. Blitzkrieg wasn't just a superstate. He also strengthened his personal belief that concentrated will, justified by technical efficiency and national zeal, makes reality what had previously been mere thought. From his office, surrounded by maps and reports, he began to map out even more ambitious steps. He believed that if the Western campaign had been a demonstration of unstoppable force, then the next act would be the final confirmation of Hitler's genius as supreme commander. The illusion of military genius. The success of the 1940 campaign confirmed in Hitler the dangerous confidence that his intuition surpassed any technical calculation. Generals might know the art of war, but only he understood its spirit. From that moment on, the Führer began to assume an increasingly direct role in military leadership, intervening in plans, altering strategies, and subordinating operational logic to the fulfillment of his ideological goals. In the early years of the conflict, he maintained a visible relationship of respect with the high command. The Wehrmacht demonstrated efficiency and discipline, and its commanders still enjoyed a certain freedom of decision-making. However, as victories accumulated, Hitler replaced professional authority with personal loyalty. He considered military prudence a form of cowardice and believed that his officers' doubts were not tactical, but symptoms of moral weakness. At headquarters in the Chancellor's Palace, and later at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, he began to direct operations with obsessive meticulousness. He demanded daily reports, corrected unit positions on maps, and rewrote entire directives. He did this with the confidence of a man who feels chosen by history. War for him was an exercise of will. And if this will was pure, it could not be defeated. At General Staff meetings, his tone changed over the months from inspired enthusiasm to an authoritarian monologue. He no longer listened to anyone. Hitler perceived military command as a spiritual act, not a technical one. According to him, generals thought in terms of lines. He thought in terms of destinies. He repeated that the men at the front were fighting not only for Germany, but for a cosmic cause, and that it was his duty to force them forward without hesitation. Losses were inevitable. Retreat was unthinkable. In his mind, every decision had to reflect the leader's faith in the Reich's historic mission. This thinking was embodied in an increasingly rigid command structure. The Supreme Command of the Army began to lose its autonomy to the new Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, created under his direct control. Hitler saw this reorganization as a way to unify strategy, but in reality, it was a mechanism for concentrating power in his hands. The most capable officers, such as Halder, Brauchitsch, and Rundstedt, began to understand that the war was fought not so much at the front as in the Führer's mind. His day was an obsessive routine. He rose late, worked through the night, slept little. He spent hours poring over maps, moving divisions with colored pencils, convinced he knew every hill and every road better than the men fighting there. He rejected negative reports and punished doubts when the offensive failed to advance. He blamed this on a lack of faith in victory. War for him was an act of faith, not calculation. In private, he despised the old Prussian aristocracy that dominated the upper echelons of the army. He believed they were incapable of understanding his political vision. While they talked strategy, he spoke of racial destiny. This ideological distance turned into mistrust. Generals who advised caution were dismissed or humiliated. Those who obeyed without question were promoted. Military meritocracy was replaced by ideological loyalty. The control he exerted over the command was also emotional. He alternated high-flown praise with bouts of rage. His style was not that of a rational strategist, but that of a prophet in a trance. He believed that his mere presence infused strength into his troops, and that his voice could change the course of battles. Officers learned to tailor reports to his expectations, smooth over failures, and invent successes. Thus, a vicious circle developed, in which military reality disappeared behind myth. Hitler drew inspiration from the images he admired in German history. Frederick the Great, Bismarck, conquerors who shaped nations through the power of decision. But in his case, history became theater. He presented himself as an omniscient commander, a self-taught genius who had broken with the dogmas of the past. Propaganda reinforced this image. Every successful operation was attributed to his personal brilliance, not to the collective work of the General Staff. This illusion of infallibility grew as fast as his victories in 1940 and 1941. Continental Europe, it turned out, bowed before him. Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, the Balkans all fell under his control. Hitler saw this as confirmation of his doctrine of absolute command. History does not reward those who waver, he said. For him, the gods were on his side, and the war was merely a stage on which he would prove his role as leader of the people. However, beneath the surface of success, a fatal flaw was brewing. By replacing technical judgment with personal faith, Hitler had transformed the command structure into an extension of his consciousness. No criticism could survive. Tactical decisions were subordinated to ideological symbols. Resistance meant faith. Retreat began to mean betrayal. Thus arose the inflexibility that would later cost millions of lives. In the summer of 1941, convinced of his infallibility, Hitler launched a campaign he considered the culmination of his destiny, the conquest of the East. What began as a war of expansion turned into a war of annihilation, a hatred of communism and the fantasy of a German empire in the East. From the early years of National Socialism, communism meant far more to Hitler than political doctrine. In his worldview, it was an existential threat. He defined it as a Jewish creature, destined to destroy nations from within and corrupt racial purity. At Mein Kampf, he had already formulated the equation that would guide his entire foreign policy. Judaism equals Bolshevism. This idea, repeated for years, became for Hitler an ideological justification for total war against the Soviet Union. The conflict with Stalin was not a dispute between systems, but a racial crusade. He saw them as inferior races, incapable of creating a culture or a state, and therefore doomed to serve as a labor force or disappear. His model of the future was a German agrarian empire stretching to the Urals and supplying the Reich with food, raw materials, and slaves. By the end of 1940, still waging war in Western Europe, Hitler was already thinking about this expansion. Operation Barbarossa began to take shape. In his mind, it was a providential undertaking. In his internal discourse, Germany had to destroy the Soviet Union not only for military security, but also to fulfill its historical destiny. In practice, the plan was devised with absolute disregard for logistical warnings. Hitler viewed the scale of Soviet territory not as a challenge, but as an opportunity to demonstrate German superiority. The orders issued before the invasion made his intentions clear. This was no ordinary war, but a war of annihilation. Political commissars of the Red Army were to be executed on the spot. Cities deprived of supplies were to be left to die of starvation. Prisoners of war were to be treated as subhuman. Hitler demanded boundless cruelty. Convinced that compassion was weakness, senior military commanders, albeit uneasily, obeyed the system he had created. Obedience was synonymous with loyalty. June 22nd. In 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border. It was the largest land invasion in history. Hitler watched the advance from the wolf's den with the excitement of a man contemplating the fulfillment of his mission. He was convinced that a few months would be enough to destroy this colossus with feet of clay. He said that simply kicking down the door would bring the entire Bolshevik structure to its knees. At first, reports seemed to confirm this. Within weeks, the German armies had taken Minsk, Smolensk, and Kyiv. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners marched west in endless columns. Hitler saw these images and spoke of them as divine punishment. Every victory was proof to him that nature rewards strength and punishes weakness. The Blitzkrieg was now spreading across the Eurasian continent like a religion. But behind the initial victories, the contradiction of his imperial dream began to emerge. The territory was too vast, the distances insurmountable. Winter was approaching, and Soviet resistance had not collapsed, as he had predicted. But Hitler refused to accept reality. He interpreted every delay as coup, as a lack of faith on the part of his generals. Bolshevism is dead. It just doesn't know it yet, he said. He ordered a continuous advance on Moscow, convinced that one great battle would decide the fate of the world. At the same time, the Nazi occupation apparatus was putting the other side of the plan into action: colonization and extermination in the conquered territories. Eine Zadgruppen received direct orders to liquidate Jews, communists, and anyone associated with the local intelligentsia. Mass murders in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states were presented by Hitler as security measures. They were part of the biological engineering of his empire, to cleanse the earth of undesirable elements in order to populate it with German settlers. The so-called General Plan Ost, drawn up by the SS under Himmler's supervision, envisioned the displacement or extermination of more than 30 million people. Internal documents spoke of evacuation, but the meaning was clear. The East was to be completely Germanized. Villages were to be destroyed. Children were to be selected based on race. Harvests were to be confiscated to supply the Reich. Hitler envisioned an orderly landscape with exemplary farms and imperial roads, populated only by pure Germans. It was a racial utopia, transformed into a state plan in Berlin. Propaganda supported the narrative of inevitable triumph. The Führer appeared surrounded by maps, pointing to advances that promised the imminent fall of Moscow. In his speech on October 3, 1941, he declared that the Soviet Union was already broken and would not rise again. But a few kilometers from the Russian capital, the advance stalled. Winter arrived earlier than expected. Temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Tanks wouldn't start. Rifles froze. Divisions lacked shelter. The generals called for retreat and regrouping, but Hitler for it. He could not accept that his vision of Germany's fate could be undermined by the weather or the resistance of peoples he considered inferior. The German soldier must learn to endure suffering, he shouted at a meeting. His decision condemned tens of thousands to die frozen in the steppes. Yet defeat did not change his conviction. The war in the East was sacred and must continue until the enemy was exterminated. The failure at Moscow marked the beginning of the end of the myth of invincibility. But within the Führer, it only strengthened his obsession. Convinced that nature itself had given him a mission, Hitler clung even more tightly to his imperial fantasy. In his mind, the East remained the key to Germany's future, a vast land purified by violence, where his people would reign for 1,000 years. However, reality began to shatter this illusion. The Soviet Union was not defeated. Its factories were churning out ever more weapons. His armies were regrouping, and winter made no racial distinctions. The Holocaust, as a central part of Hitler's military project, the Jewish question was not a social problem to be solved within the Reich. It was a strategic figure on his military plan. From the very beginning of his political lexicon, anti-Semitism occupied a central place alongside war. This hostility became a state policy and an instrument for maximizing the resources of the conflict. Thus, the systematic extermination of Jews was formulated not only as an ideological goal, but also as a means of ensuring military effectiveness, economic exploitation, and the demographic reorganization of the continent. For Hitler, the Jewish presence was inseparable from the decline he attributed to the West and the Bolshevik threat he attributed to the East. In his logic, the extermination of the Jews meant cleansing the nation of a supposed tumor, and at the same time, depriving the internal enemy of its economic and cultural networks. The practical cleansing of entire communities freed up assets that could be expropriated to finance the war and maintain the state apparatus for a leadership that viewed society as a manageable resource. Repression also had a utilitarian purpose. The apparatus that transformed hatred into action was a complex mechanism in which Hitler delegated functions and legitimacy. Himmler and the SS were responsible for translating ideological intent into administrative and operational processes. Mobile extermination squads of the Einsatzgruppe followed the Wehrmacht's advance in 1941, committing massacres behind Soviet lines. The killings at Babmiera in Kiev or across the vast Ukrainian plains were, from the leadership's perspective, security measures designed to eliminate potential centers of resistance and eliminate those considered enemies on ethnic or political grounds. The logistics of the crime evolved along with the war. What began as mass shootings in open pits was rationalized and technically formalized into ghetto camps, deportations, and finally, industrial death centers. The creation of concentration and extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec followed a methodical planning that combined bureaucracy with genetics. A sidle impulse. Documents, orders, transport lists, and accounting records show how administrative efficiency served a criminal purpose. For Hitler and his comrades, the ability to organize extermination was a demonstration of complete control over society and the war. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 symbolized the transformation of anti-Semitism into state policy on a pan-European scale. At it, high-ranking Reich officials coordinated the mechanisms for the deportation and treatment of the Jewish population in territories under German control. From the Führer's perspective, these decisions were not moral errors, but logical steps in the consolidation of a racial empire that demanded the suppression of everything considered impure. The technical rationality applied at Wannsee and in the ministries revealed the coldness with which extermination was approached. Death was calculated, measured, and organized with the same meticulousness with which offensives and supplies were planned. Hitler also saw an instrumental dimension in the use of prisoner labor. The camps were not only places of extermination, they also became sources of slave labor for the war industry and the occupation economy. German companies and military administrations profited from forced labor. Thus, economic exploitation was aligned with the military goal, maintaining production and supplies in conditions of shortages. From the Führer's desk, the logic was clear. If war required resources, repression could provide them. The connection between war and genocide was also expressed in the displacement of international norms. Under the pretext of security, conventions were abandoned, protection of civilians was abolished, and law was redefined as an instrument of exception. Hitler saw in this an opportunity to legitimize practices that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. In the language of the regime, the military exception justified the extraordinary measures systematically applied against Jews and other persecuted groups. Even when the military leadership might have warned of the strategic and logistical risks of diverting resources to mass repression, Hitler insisted that the extermination of undesirable elements was inseparable from military success. In his calculations, allowing the existence of communities considered subversive was a risk greater than any depletion of military material. Moreover, the policy of internal terror served to intimidate entire populations and reduce the possibility of sabotage or resistance in occupied territories. Repression thus became an instrument of pacification and territorial control. The human cost of these decisions was immeasurable, and for the Nazi state machine, it was also a variable included in planning. Deportations by rail, systematic selection upon arrival, and a continuous flow of men, women, and children, subjected to an industrial process of extermination. Hitler not only tolerated this machine, he legitimized it in historical and biological terms, presenting it as a necessary act for the survival of the German people. In his narrative, extermination was a historical task, comparable in its gravity to the great political enterprises that, he claimed, forged nations. As the war expanded and the front lines shifted, genocidal policy remained a priority. This was not an incidental policy, not an accident. It was a central part of the regime's political and military project. The fatal error was the underestimation of the Soviet Union and the Russian winter. The campaign against the Soviet Union was marked by a double miscalculation that, in Hitler's mind, could not exist. Underestimating the enemy's capacity for resistance and underestimating the power of nature. Both elements, which for any prudent military leader would have been key variables, were for him unnecessary obstacles in the path of destiny. He considered it inescapable. This mixture of arrogance and denial ultimately became an open wound that would ultimately bleed the Reich dry in the summer of 1941. The scale of the invasion surpassed all precedents. More than 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft rushed east at a devastating pace. The initial successes seemed to confirm the logic of blitzkrieg: deep penetrations, encirclement of large forces, and the collapse of the enemy's state apparatus. But simultaneously, as the division advanced, supply lines stretched out in a geometry that German logistics had never before encountered on such a scale. Dirt roads turned into stretches of mud. Railroad routes had different track gauges. Depots were located hundreds of kilometers from the mobile columns. All this undermined the promise of a continuous offensive. Hitler refused to accept that the war in the East required a different method of waging it. For him, the flexibility demonstrated in Western Europe had to be identically replicated in Russia. He demanded that units advance without halt, that the offensive be ruthless until the final breakthrough. When the Supreme Command, when the proposal suggested pauses for reorganization, securing communications, and redeploying supplies, the Führer interpreted this proposal as a lack of will. The enemy will break if we advance, he insisted. Convinced that any respite, a moral and strategic concession, the operational solution, symbolizing this mixture of faith and error, was the dispersion of targets. Instead of concentrating all forces on a decisive objective such as Moscow, Hitler approved the diversion of large units to the south and north. the seizure of Ukraine with its agricultural and industrial resources, and the siege of Leningrad with its symbolic and historical significance. For him, possession of these territories was both a material issue and an assertion of racial dominance. The generals who urged prioritization and concentration watched as the company dispersed across fronts, each with its own resource drain. Intelligence also contributed to maintaining the illusion. Optimistic reports of the internal disintegration of the Soviet Union, faulty calculations of industrial mobilization, capabilities, and an underestimation of the spirit of resistance fueled a false confidence in a quick victory. Hitler, already living in a realm of certainties, accepted these interpretations as confirmation in his speeches and meetings. He rejected the possibility of a long war. He considered it a tactical heresy. This structural denial of uncertainty led him to plan with supposed precision what was by definition unpredictable. When winter arrived, reality cruelly refuted this confidence. The Russian cold was not a metaphor. It was a mechanism that destroyed logistics and men. Extreme temperatures froze carburetors, greases hardened, and reduced vehicle mobility. Roads became traps, trucks became stuck, and the lack of clothing and rations turned troops into victims of the climate as much as of the battle. Logistical problems, such as a lack of adequate winter clothing, a shortage of spare parts, or disrupted supply chains, revealed that advances were possible only through momentary daring, not sustained effort. Instead of acknowledging that nature had erected a barrier, Hitler interpreted stagnation as proof of cowardice or betrayal. Requests for retreat or reorganization were viewed as acts of moral capitulation. Instead of delegating to his military commanders with full technical authority, he tightened orders and prohibitions. No retreat, hold positions at all costs, severely punish any local initiative that contradicted higher policy. War ceased to be an adaptive process and became a dogmatic command. This religious transformation of strategy had concrete consequences. Units found themselves immobilized in positions that supply could not support. Casualties from weather and combat accelerated. Morale sank under conditions that propaganda could not conceal. The human wave, which had believed itself capable of civilizing the East, began to suffer the erosion of fatigue and hunger. Frontline reports, previously adjusted so as not to irritate the Führer, began to accumulate figures that could not be concealed. Mounting losses, insufficient supply lines, and Soviet industrial capacity, which was moving factories beyond the Urals and increasing its production. The underestimation of the enemy also manifested itself in the failure to anticipate popular resistance and partisan warfare, where Hitler expected the capitulation of the inferior peoples. The occupation was met with sabotage and partisans, a war of attrition, which manyfold increased the need for occupation troops. Every act of civilian repression, conceived as an instrument of racial pacification, fueled the resistance and diverted military resources to internal repression. The line between operations against armies and security operations blurred, and the military effort fragmented into 1,000 conflicting tasks. In the Chancellery, the response was a repetition of will. Hitler became even more locked in his cycle of imperative decisions. The very idea of a strategic retreat became politically unacceptable. Mistakes were no longer merely tactical. They had become a political principle and a test of character. To bow to the obvious facts would have meant admitting that his historical vision was fallible, and in his mental model, this was tantamount to betrayal. The combination of uncontrollable distances, resurgent resistance, extreme weather conditions, and political decisions that defied logistical logic created a web of problems. Every attempt at a partial solution met with an unfavorable response. Reorganization delayed operations, strengthening fronts weakened other areas, insistence on offensives prolonging losses. What initially seemed like a show of force turned into a trap of attrition, the entry of the United States into the war. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor changed the global balance. For Hitler, this news came as an unexpected blow. But he interpreted it through the same ideological prism as everything else, not as a warning, but as a confirmation of his worldview. For months, intelligence services had been informing him of growing tensions between Japan and the United States. However, even the most optimistic high command strategists did not believe that Tokyo would directly attack such an industrialized power. When the radio announced the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Hitler reacted with a mixture of euphoria and relief in his view. Japan's entry meant the opening of a second front that would distract the Reich's Western enemies. This was, in his words, an alliance of militant nations against the empire of money and decadence. On December 11th, without being attacked by Washington, Germany declared war on the United States. This decision was not discussed with either the military command or its diplomatic advisors. It was an act of ideological impulse. Hitler considered it inevitable. If the world was divided between two irreconcilable orders, an all-out clash was bound to occur. In his speech to the Reichstag, he spoke of Roosevelt as the mouthpiece of international Judaism and presented the war as a crusade against capitalism and communism, now united in a single bloc. America's entry had changed the balance of power in the war in a way that even he couldn't measure. Until then, Germany had faced European powers with limited or disorganized resources. Now it had to fight against an industrialized continent with almost infinite productive capacity. In 1942, American factories began producing more airplanes, tanks, and ships than all of Europe combined. But Hitler, captivated by his own belief in the power of will over matter, dismissed these figures in nightly conferences. He repeated that the real enemy was not at the front, but in the corrupt minds that controlled the press and the economy. The war, he said, was to be a global clash of civilizations. This ideological interpretation blinded him to the logistical dimension of the conflict he himself had provoked. While the United States expanded its production, Germany remained tied to the resources it managed to extract from occupied territories and to an industrial system already showing signs of fatigue. His reaction was to tighten domestic political controls. Partial defeats on the Eastern Front, the failure at Moscow, and the beginning of Allied bombing raids on Germany pushed him toward the rhetoric of total resistance. In his speeches of 1942 and 1943, Hitler spoke of a final world war between the nations of the spirit and the nations of money. He demanded absolute sacrifice from the German people. The enemy was no longer the army, but the entire world. Goebbels' propaganda adapted the narrative. Factories worked tirelessly, while the population endured rationing and the first bombing raids. Newsreels showed images of ruins, with heroic music playing in the background. Glorifying resistance, Hitler appeared in public less frequently, but when he did, his figure still radiated authority. The masses still saw him as the man who had restored national pride, not a leader who was pushing Germany into an ever deeper abyss. Inwardly, the Führer remained convinced that the tide of the war could be turned with a decisive maneuver. Despite the warnings of his generals, he refused to withdraw troops from the Eastern Front. He preferred to lose entire divisions than to admit that the dream of dominating Eurasia was over. In his private conversations, the United States' entry was described as an accidental provocation of international Zionism. In reality, it made him the unwitting architect of a war that could not be won. Meanwhile, the Allies were forming an unprecedented coalition, a collaboration between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. Combined resources, intelligence, and strategy, the mass production of military equipment in America, and the supply of the Soviet Union via routes such as the Arctic, turned material superiority into an avalanche. Hitler knew this, but rejected any quantitative comparisons. Machines do not defeat men, he insisted. His faith in the collective German will remained his last argument. From 1943 onward, the difference between faith and delusion became irreconcilable. The Eastern Front was slowly collapsing, North Africa was lost, and Italy was beginning to waver as an ally. But Hitler refused to acknowledge that the war had become a struggle of desperate resistance. In his words, Germany could not lose. Only the Germans could fail. This phrase, spoken coldly, defined his new strategy. Strengthen internal discipline, eliminate all doubts, and prolong the war beyond all logical sense. On February 18, 1943, Goebbels delivered his famous speech on total war in Berlin, reflecting the Führer's thinking. It was a tacit admission that the imperial dream had failed, but also an attempt to turn the catastrophe into an epic of sacrifice. Direct confrontations with key war generals transformed Hitler into a commander who no longer tolerated nuances. His absolute power within the Reich accustomed him to an environment where any disagreement was interpreted as betrayal. On the military front, this mentality pitted him against the very people who had brilliantly carried out his orders in his early years. Tensions with the generals turned into a theater of suspicion, dismissals, and public humiliations. War ceased to be a collective endeavor and became an extension of the Führer's temperament. One of the first to experience this confrontation was Gert von Runge, a Prussian army veteran who had served in almost every major German military enterprise. Respected for his experience, he represented a professional tradition that Hitler despised on the Western Front during 1941 and 1942. He dared to express what many silently thought, that total war was unsustainable, that the lines were overextended, and that the enemy had material superiority. Hitler interpreted these remarks as defeatism. He fired him for lack of faith in victory and temporarily replaced him, though he later rehired him, recognizing his competence. From then on, every meeting between them was a silent struggle between military reality and political stubbornness. Heinz Guderian, the intellectual creator of the Blitzkrieg, was another target of this tension. Guderian demonstrated that mobility and surprise could decide the outcome of a war, but his directness made him intolerable to Hitler. When the Russian winter halted the offensive of 1941, Guderian insisted on a retreat to preserve units and reorganize logistics. Hitler accused him of cowardice. In December, he removed him from command and sent him to the reserves. Guderian, who embodied the technical innovations of the German army, became a pariah within the structure he had helped create. He was rehabilitated only in 1943, when the catastrophe in the East forced Hitler to revisit his former critics, albeit under strict supervision. The most telling case was that of Erwin Rommel, the desert fox of Africa. Rommel became a hero both to the German people and to the regime's propaganda. His audacity and tactical acumen made him a legend, but his independence earned the Führer's mistrust. Hitler admired his victories, but was irritated by Rommel's tendency to act without orders. When the situation in North Africa began to deteriorate, Rommel warned that it was impossible to hold out without reinforcements and fuel. He proposed a withdrawal to defensive positions. Hitler, true to his dogma of not ceding land, accused him of defecing and ordered him to fight to the end. In private conversations, he called Rommel a tourist general, incapable of understanding the ideological dimension of war. The collapse of the Afrika Korps and the loss of North Africa in 1943 ended their relationship. Although Rommel continued serving in Europe, the Führer no longer trusted him. When he was indirectly implicated in the July 20th plot in 1944, his fate was sealed. Hitler offered him a choice: a public trial, which would drag his family down with it, or a quiet suicide. Rommel chose the latter option for the Führer. His death was another necessary purge in the name of history. It became a symbol of the final rift between the military ideal and the political madness of the regime. The disagreements were not limited to external fronts within the internal structure of the Supreme Command. Hitler fostered an atmosphere of rivalry and surveillance that undermined any effective coordination. Rivalry between the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and the SS was deliberately encouraged. Göring, Himmler, and Keitel spied on each other to earn the Führer's trust. Reports were filed, figures were distorted, defeats were manipulated, and defeats were disguised as partial victories. Amid this tangle of disinformation, Hitler made decisions, increasingly detached from reality. But no one dared contradict him. His distrust was absolute. He saw conspiracies in every delay and every proposed retreat. At meetings, his tone would shift from cold calm to outbursts of rage in a matter of minutes. He would throw objects, slam the table, shout at officers until they fell silent. Tactical discussions turned into ideological interrogations. He asked not what they thought, but what they believed. War had become a test of personal faith. The Führer commands. History obeys, he repeated, confident that the cards would bend to his will. In 1944, tensions reached an irreversible point. The Allied landings in Normandy exposed the fragility of the command system. The generals asked for freedom of maneuver to react quickly. Hitler insisted on directing every movement from his bunker, refusing to acknowledge that the front, changing every minute, required different tactics. Rundstedt, again commanding in the west, begged for permission to retreat and reorganize the defense. Hitler, firm on this, declared, "There can be no retreat on German soil." A few days later, he sacked him again. A chain of contradictory orders prevailed. The defense was thrown into chaos. As the Allies advanced, the Führer remained convinced that a miraculous counterattack would change the situation. The generals who had been his tools became his victims. Many were demoted, arrested, or forced to commit suicide. Those who remained by his side did so more out of fear than conviction. Hitler had achieved what he had always wanted, an army completely subordinated to his will, suicidal orders, and a denial of reality. In the final years of the war, Hitler's leadership ceased to be an exercise in strategy and became a series of impossible commands. His grip on reality cracked under the weight of defeats. Nevertheless, his power, fueled by fear and fanaticism, remained inviolable. Orders became expressions of will without material basis or tactical meaning. Resist, die, sacrifice. These words replaced any military logic. The Führer turned war into a liturgy, where every loss had to be justified as proof of purity. Stalingrad was the turning point. The city, now a symbol, had absorbed the last vestiges of rationality in German strategy. Since the summer of 1942, Hitler had insisted on its capture not for its industrial value, but for its name. Victory was destined to be a direct humiliation for Stalin when the Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, found itself surrounded by Soviet troops in the winter of 1942. Commanders requested permission to break through the encirclement and withdraw. Hitler forbade it. Stalingrad would be taken or lost to the last man, he ordered. For weeks, German soldiers held out amid ruins and bitter frost, surrounded by a growing enemy. The Luftwaffe promised supplies by air, but reality proved otherwise. Aircraft could barely cover a fraction of daily needs. Nevertheless, Hitler demanded that positions be held. His logic was symbolic. If Stalingrad fell, the myth of German infallibility would collapse with it. When General Paulus capitulated on February 2nd, 1943, with nearly 100,000 starving survivors, Hitler deemed him a traitor. He should have committed suicide, like a true German, he said, unable to accept that his order had led to the destruction of an entire army. From that moment on, retreat disappeared from his vocabulary. Every front was to be held at all costs. Officers who attempted to argue rationally were dismissed or sent to the front without command. From 1943 onward, the German war machine operated under a single slogan: resist, even if there are no weapons, no fuel, no men left. Defeated divisions were recreated on paper, and orders came from the bunker with mathematical precision and a complete disconnect from reality. Hitler directed battles with maps and pins, believing that the front obeyed geometry. The gap between his decisions and the reality of the battlefield became a chasm. The same phenomenon repeated itself at Kursk in the summer of 1943. Hitler insisted on launching a large-scale offensive to regain the initiative in the east. Convinced that a decisive blow could turn the tide of the war, the generals warned that the element of surprise had been lost, that the Soviet troops were ready, and that the enemy's material superiority was already overwhelming. He ignored all reports. Operation Citadel ended in disaster. Thousands of tanks were destroyed, losses became irreparable, and this finally put an end to the German offensive on the Eastern Front. But for Hitler, the reasons were not logistical or strategic, but spiritual. "We lacked faith," he muttered to his officer, pointing at the map with a trembling hand. As the Reich retreated, the scale of these suicidal orders escalated. In 1944, After the Allied landings in Normandy and the collapse of the Western Front, Hitler forbade any retreat on German soil. Every city was to become a fortress. Every soldier. Berlin, Danzig, Breslau, Königsberg. All were declared places of total resistance. The slogan was a death sentence. Whoever surrenders will be executed. Whoever survives must resist. Meanwhile, civilians were mobilized into improvised militias. Children of the Hitler Youth were given rifles and banners of glory, while the SS summarily executed those who tried to flee. The disintegration of the state was disguised as discipline. Hitler saw the suffering of the people as a form of national redemption. Losses were inevitable. Defeat was impossible. In the Führer's rhetoric, every destroyed city was a sacrifice in the name of German greatness. Goebbels. His propaganda spoke of heroic sacrifice, while Allied bombs obliterated Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin in military reports. Casualty figures were omitted or transformed into abstract numbers. Arguing with the truth became a luxury the regime could no longer afford. The Führer's isolation reached its peak in 1945, locked in the Reich Chancellery bunker, surrounded by secretaries, adjutants, and a small circle of devoted officers. Hitler continued to dictate orders to non-existent armies. He demanded impossible maneuvers, he sought counterattacks from fronts that no longer existed. His aides drew lines on maps, knowing these units had been destroyed weeks earlier, but no one dared correct him. Meetings turned into rituals of obedience. Everyone nodded. Everyone pretended. The war continued. As the Soviet noose tightened around Berlin, his orders took on a purge tone. He ordered the execution of officers accused of weakness, ordered the destruction of vital infrastructure to prevent the enemy from exploiting it, and ordered the burning of archives and works of art. His final logic was simple and devastating. If Germany had failed its historic mission, it must disappear along with it. "The German people have betrayed me," he said at his last war conference. "They deserve to survive this complete collapse." The July 20th, 1944. Plot. The assassination attempt of July 20th, 1944, was more than a simple attempt to take Hitler's life. It signified the internal collapse of the blind loyalty that had sustained the regime for years. Hitler was an untouchable figure within the German hierarchy. The personal oath of allegiance, established since 1934, transformed any resistance into a sacred crime. But when the war turned into a catastrophe, a group of officers, diplomats, and members of the General Staff began to consider the unthinkable, eliminating the Führer to save what remained of Germany. General Klaus von Stauffenberg, crippled in Africa and witnessing the collapse of the Reich, embodied the contradiction of a military elite that had served the regime with discipline, but now saw him as a destroyer of the nation. He was joined by officers such as Henning von Tresca, Ludwig Beck, and Erwin von Riesch, Lebanon among others. The plan was simple in concept and nearly impossible to execute. To take control of Berlin with Operation Valkyrie, a contingency plan originally conceived to suppress internal uprisings and negotiate peace with the Allies before fully occupying the country by July 20th. Stauffenberg arrived at the meeting at the headquarters in Rustenburg with a bomb hidden in his briefcase. He placed the device under the table where Hitler was reviewing maps with his officers at 12:42 p.m. The explosion destroyed the room, killing 4 people and wounding several others present. But Hitler survived. The oak table absorbed most of the impact and saved his life. This detail changed the course of history. The following hours were a combination of confusion and fateful predetermination. In Berlin, the conspirators briefly believed that the Führer was dead. They activated Operation Valkyrie, mobilized troops, arrested SS members, and began issuing orders in the name of the new provisional government. But Hitler's voice, coming over the radio from Brandenburg that same night, destroyed all hope. "I am alive, and my revenge will be terrible," he said. The coup collapsed within hours. Hitler interpreted the assassination attempt not as an act of patriotic despair, but as a confirmation of his worldview. A network of internal traitors ready to destroy him from within, The suspicion that had been an instrument of control for years turned into a total obsession. He ordered an immediate purge. Within days, thousands were arrested. The People's Court, headed by Roland Freisler, turned the trials into public spectacles of humiliation. The accused were insulted, beaten, and hanged from piano wires. Their bodies were displayed as a warning. The circle of power shrank even further. Hitler no longer trusted anyone outside his immediate circle. He saw enemies, even among his most loyal. The few generals who tried to reason with him were sidelined or forced to resign. The chain of command, already weakened, became a labyrinth of terror. Not a single officer knew whether his superior would survive. In the following week, the politics of fear paralyzed decision-making and destroyed the last vestiges of military cooperation. Psychologically, the assassination marked Hitler's final descent into paranoid isolation. His health noticeably deteriorated, uncontrollable trembling, insomnia, prolonged bouts of rage. He spent sleepless days, locked in his bunker, staring at maps with a hand that could no longer hold a pencil firmly. He spoke of the process as if it were a personal account. Only the power of fate protects me. He repeated this, convinced that his survival was proof of divine election. The subsequent purge destroyed not only the conspirators, but also anyone who would ever express doubt. Officers, officials, priests, and members of the aristocracy were executed without evidence. In the following months, more than 5,000 people were killed in the purge. Germany, which Hitler had promised to unite under an ideal, was now plunged into a wave of violence directed against itself. The political effect was devastating. The army lost many of its most capable leaders, and fear suppressed initiative at the front. The troops fought without hope, while in Berlin, internal betrayal was declared the explanation for all defeats. In his delirium, Hitler saw sabotage in every failure. If everyone had followed me with faith, victory would have been ours, he said, at a meeting with his ministers, pounding his fist on the table. From that moment on, the Führer ruled a country in ruins, supported only by fanatics and bureaucrats who feared his wrath more than defeat. What began as a desperate attempt to save Germany ultimately solidified dictatorship in its purest form, the form of a lone man who no longer listened, surrounded by empty obedience. Ending in a bunker, from the Messiah of the Reich to a sunken leader. The Führer, once omnipresent, became a shadow, locked underground, presiding over an empire that existed only on the maps on his desk. His world shrank to a concrete and steel labyrinth, the Führerbunker, in the gardens of the Reichskanzlei in Berlin. There, surrounded by secretaries, officers, doctors, and personal assistants, Hitler spent his last 120 days. The bunker was filled with damp air, narrow corridors, and lights that never went out. His routine was an echo of the past. He reviewed reports that no longer reflected anything real, dictated orders to non-existent armies, and reprimanded generals who had long since lost control of their units. His circle grew smaller with each passing day. Eva Braun, his companion for many years, remained by his side. Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, was the last staunch believer. Outside, Germany had ceased to exist. Berlin was a field of ruins. Children of the Hitler Youth patrolled the streets with handheld grenade launchers. Civilians were killed by bombing raids, and shelters were overflowing. Hitler, however, refused to leave the capital. He said that his destiny must be fulfilled where his greatness had begun. His faith in Providence became his ultimate dogma. If the German people failed, they must be destroyed along with them. Hitler's physical exhaustion was obvious. He suffered from constant tremors, could barely walk, and his speeches degenerated into incoherent monologues. He spoke of impossible counterattacks by divisions that no longer existed, of secret weapons capable of changing the course of the war. His aides pretended to take notes. General staff meetings degenerated into empty ceremonies, where unrealistic military reports were read out and maps depicting already captured territories were plotted. Sometimes he would spend minutes in silence, staring at the floor, before exploding with rage. In April 1945, when Soviet troops crossed the Oder and approached Berlin, Hitler still ordered a total defense. Divisions consisting of teenagers, old men, and the remnants of defeated units were ordered to fight to the end. Goebbels organized radio broadcasts in which he promised the rebirth of the Reich and compared the situation to the fall of Rome for believers. Dying for Hitler was a form of atonement for the rest. Only silence remained. On April 16th, the final Soviet offensive on Berlin began. In less than 2 weeks, the encirclement was complete. Hitler continued to issue orders to phantom armies, believing that the general's 12th Army would come to the rescue of the city. None of these forces existed anymore as combat-ready structures. And yet, he ordered imaginary counterattacks, convinced that fate would once again intervene in his favor. The following days became a descent into delirium. On April 29, 1945, Hitler dictated his political testament, which was written down by his secretary. Junger attended. In it, he placed the blame for the war on the Jews and reaffirmed his belief in the historic mission of National Socialism. He appointed Karl Dönitz as his successor, Goebbels the Reichstag, and left instructions to ensure that his body would not fall into enemy hands. That night, he married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony inside the bunker. There was champagne and silence. At dawn on April 30th, Berlin burned as Soviet troops broke through the surrounding streets. Hitler said goodbye to his staff. He retired to his room with Eva Braun. He ordered that he not be disturbed. Soon after, a shot rang out. When his adjutants opened the door, they found him lying on the sofa. A shot to the temple. A broken cyanide capsule was in his mouth. Eva Braun lay next to him, also poisoned. The bodies were wrapped in a blanket, doused with gasoline, and burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, according to his instructions. The news spread through the corridors of the bunker like a discreet rumor. Goebbels and his faithful wife committed suicide the following day, along with his wife. After the murder of their 6 children, the remnants of the regime dissolved in fire and smoke. In the following days, the Soviet army took the Reich Chancellery, and the Reich, destined to last 1,000 years, disappeared after 12 years. Guys, I have a personal recommendation for you. If you want to dive even deeper into what Hitler did during his rule, check out the list of videos I've linked in the description, or visit my channel, where you'll find plenty of video content that should interest you. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoy my content, don't forget to support the channel by subscribing so I can see your activity.